So many of you know that I grew up unchurched. I didn't go to any particular church growing up. My father was an atheist. My mother was sort of agnostic, kind of new age, that kind of thing. If we went to church, it was sort of as an anthropological study of, my mother would say, you need to have this experience. So I remember living in a village in Alaska, for example, we went to the Easter Russian Orthodox service. And then the next week we went to a sweat lodge. So these were all sort of our explorations into that. So really, we also moved around so much. Both my parents loved to travel and they liked to explore new areas. I think at last count, I'm somewhere on my 70th address. Which is kind of like, okay, and no more thank you. So all of this to say is that I didn't really grow up with a community, like an intentional community that you join. I'm not talking about the accidental communities that you find yourself in from time to time, where you just really, but a place where you make a commitment to being part of a particular community. And mostly what we're talking about today is really the communities of churches, but there are certainly others that are out there. So community is just, it's very new to me. And I also often felt in the past sort of like an outsider looking in, and I still feel like I'm learning about what community is. And all along all of this, you can imagine then that my spirituality, the ways that I expressed it, was often reflective of that lack of community. It was very individualistic. So for example, where I sort of came into my own sense of spirituality was really in the mountains, being alone, walking around there in the forests among the trees. I took workshops. I'm a shamanic practitioner, which ironically is a little bit solitary, even though usually shamans are actually in a community when they work. But our urban shamans tend to be much more individual. I did things like journeying or lectio divina, those types of communal, non-communal spiritual practices. And I remember one day, long before I heard my call to ministry, or actually it was actually about 6 months before, I was thinking about my own spiritual evolution and what I wanted to do, and I was like, well, I've tried these things, and I felt like something was missing. Something needed to happen. And I remember the answer as I was sitting there sort of in a sense of meditation or prayer. I remember the answer came to me, and it said, you need to be in community. I was like, really? Well, first of all, I was like, but I don't go to church. I don't want to go to church. I grew up with a family that was anti-church. Never thought I could be a part of a church. And they said, no, you need to be a part of a spiritual community because that is truly where spiritual evolution happens. That is your next stage of maturity, Sean. And it's a hard thing to think of because in community you have to make room for someone else other than yourself. They have their own spiritual growth, right? They've got their own things that they're learning, and those things can kind of butt up against each other. You aren't actually the only person who needs to grow and learn and become. Being part of a community is a greater challenge and it has a greater reward. A community or church is where you can find this. Remember Parker Palmer, he calls true community the place where we nurture human growth and expansiveness. Because when you run up against someone else, you are going to expand. But of course, then I had that problem, right? Well, if I'm going to join a community, and if that's going to be a church, I didn't know anything about Unitarian Universalism. And I was so torn. I looked at a lot of different churches, but I couldn't get beyond creeds. I couldn't get beyond, I loved the Jewish faith, but it wasn't quite right for me. I tried Quakers. It wasn't still quite right for me. I was talking one day with a friend of mine about lamenting the fact that I love to join a church, but I can't do those darn creeds. I can't sit there and say I believe something that I don't. And she said, well, what do you believe? I don't know. I can't remember what I told her. I said something or other. And she goes, oh, you're a UU. Like, okay, what's a UU? She said a Unitarian Universalist. It turns out, actually, she had spent quite a bit of her youth as a UU, and her mother was a Unitarian Universalist. She said, you've got to check them out. So that's how I eventually came to become a Unitarian Universalist. And I'll tell you the story at some point about the first time I ever went to a UU church. It was kind of amusing. But when I first joined, I had this kind of dreamy idea about what church was and what community was, right? Because we lift up such wonderful things in our churches. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another, right? Those are big goals. I thought, oh, this is so great to be a part of something like that, and I can believe in my own beliefs, and everybody can have their beliefs. There's truth in all this. How absolutely fabulous. Well, this is what Parker Palmer is talking about sometimes, that we can romanticize or sentimentalize community. And that's when we make it an idol. We make it something that it's actually not. We think it'll cure all the ills. We expect everyone to be there for us all the time. That it will never fail us. It's a place of great peace and harmony. But really what it is that community is not for the faint of heart. It is the place where you go if you really want to grow and expand who you are. Because you will encounter people who drive you crazy, or maybe they even hurt your feelings. You will encounter people who will challenge and who will push you, but you will also encounter people who will be there for you when you need them. They'll support you when you feel lost and hopeless. People will stand by you. People will celebrate your successes. You will find friends who will last a lifetime in community. But community is one of the most difficult and most effective forms of spiritual practice out there. Because in all of that, all of those individual things that you learn about listening, patience, compassion, well, you got to bring them all to bear when you're in community. There you get to practice leadership or even followership. How do you follow leaders and do it appropriately? It can be one of the most rewarding things. You can learn about yourself. You can expand yourself. You can face challenges. You find a place to belong. This is truly the place to be if you want to grow and expand yourself. But some people leave because it can be really hard. We want a place sometimes where you can just go and it can be all easy and perfect and everything. But that place really doesn't exist unless you want to go up into the mountains. That's fine, you can go up there. That's a lovely place. You know, they get mad at one person or even just a few people. And sometimes people take a break, and that's okay. Sometimes we do need a break from communities. But if you really want to learn and grow, stay through the hard parts. Because that's when we all learn to expand and to practice that compassion and listening. And why is it so hard? Why is it sometimes really hard in our churches? This church is actually a really healthy church in so many ways. But I know so many churches, we struggle with a lot of this. And I think, honestly, in this church, our biggest challenge is the opposite of what it is in other churches. For us, I believe it is our democratic polity. It's our biggest spiritual practice. Because we don't encounter democracy every day in our everyday lives, right? But we do it here. In our everyday lives, we've got hierarchy, right? You've got a boss, and your boss probably has a boss. Maybe they even have a boss, right? And you're somewhere in there. You might be a boss yourself. You have people that may be under you. But it's very hierarchical, and so people tell people what to do rather than saying, hey, we're in this together. What might be the best way of doing this? Because that's really hard. We sort of practice it maybe once every 2 years where we just go out and vote. But even that really isn't democracy. I was recently at a demonstration. I'll tell you about it in a little bit. But one of the chants that they do there is they say, what does democracy look like? This is what democracy looks like. And it is. That's part of what democracy looks like, is getting up and standing up for what you believe in. And that in itself is really hard to do. In our democratic polity, and here I'm going to even have a nice little slide for you. It'll work. There we go. So this is sort of basically this is the sense of our hierarchy. It's pretty straightforward, which really isn't much. The minister and the board are both elected. The board's elected for a very specific term. The minister is we're sort of like Supreme Court justices. We're sort of elected for a lifetime in a sense, but we can be unelected. Just like the board can too. It just rarely ever happens. But you know, we report to the congregation. That is all of you, right? And then so who does the congregation report to? Well, we have a mission. In some churches they might say God, right? That's not necessarily our church. You might put it there. But in our church we might talk about that we report to a mission. In other words, how are we living our mission in the world? That's where we look to our guidance. Because sometimes we need something outside of ourselves to hold us to that higher ideal, because we are ourselves sometimes, you know, we can get cranky, get a little suspicious of things at times. So it's good to have that mission that's there. Now, what you'll notice is something that's very interesting about this democratic polity. This is very different from most churches. Most churches, oftentimes, honestly, the minister is at the top, right? The minister is in charge. I am not in charge of this congregation. Now, that doesn't mean I don't have power. I have a lot of power, but I actually don't have that much authority. Authority is what you all give me in my contract to say, here, Sean, here's what you're in charge of. So I'm in charge of, for example, worship, pastoral care, I manage the staff, that kind of thing. But almost all the other things are really the authority of the board, who then may give it off then, some of the authority off to various committees. And this is kind of an interesting thing because people often come to me and say, so Sean, can I do this? And I have to say, that sounds lovely to me. Take it to this committee or take it to this board. People think that I can answer that question for you. And sometimes, honestly, I think I can answer that question for myself. Like, no, Sean, you really can't. I can help you navigate the channels, that sort of thing. But this is not true in other churches. I have a friend of mine who's a Lutheran minister, and she's in charge. If she wants a program to go, that program will go. If she doesn't want a program to go, that program won't go. I actually do not have that authority. I'm not given that authority by this congregation. That's part of our democratic polity, but it's also part of what we call shared ministry. We are all ministers, and we share it. I'm just the capital M, the one who got the degree and the ordination and all of that. But we're all ministers in this. We all have our own lines of authority. And the idolatry of religious communities is often the idolatry of ministers or even a board, even of the leaders, to say, oh, they're the ones who do everything. When people assume that I have the power to make things happen in Congress, and it's a fallacy sometimes that even I believe, and I can even get idolatrous at times. The bottom line really is that if you want to grow as a person, to deepen your spirituality and to grow, there's no place like community or church. There's no place like it to do this. Because it is really hard. We have to stop and say, okay, who are we going to give the authority to that to? And how are we going to do that? And what's best for this community? Not just what I want, but what is best for everyone. That's not easy to do. And how you get the most out of this spiritual practice of community is that you don't sit on the sidelines. You have to take some risks. You have to jump in and sort of get your hands dirty, as it were. You have to take on something, maybe something you've never even done before. I know people in this church who sort of were asked to do something like, okay, sure, they've never done it before, but why not take it on? Because why not? Expand yourself and to grow. In this church, as I said, we call this shared ministry. Remember, ministry means to serve. It's not just for ministers. Now, ministers, we often have what we call a calling, right? So we're called to ministry. Now, calling is different from a ministry. Some people are called to be teachers, for example. Maybe they're called to be soldiers. Maybe they're called to be musicians. But we can all also have a ministry. I think each of us has a ministry. It's when we are committed to something larger than ourselves. When we know we're putting something in. For some people here in this church, that's when we reach out to someone who is hurting. When we water plants or weed the patio or we caulk the churches, things, we act as slideshow operators or ushers, making a greeter, maybe we sing in the choir, we sit on the board or a committee. These are all different ministries. But actually, what's the difference between being a minister and volunteering? There is a difference between being a minister and volunteering. This actually was brought up to me. I was having a conversation with one of our congregants here, Maureen, and she said, we aren't volunteers here. That's something entirely different than what we do. I got me really thinking about it. But yeah, there is something different between what we do here than just being volunteers. It has to do with being ministers. And this came across to me as I was talking about, I told you I was at a protest on Thursday. Reverend Sarah Halverson over at Fairview Community Church, she's been involved in this community for eons, and I'm new here. She said, Sean, would you be willing to come out? We're going to be doing a bunch of protests and talking to various managers at the El Super stores around Orange County. All day long, we're kind of getting, because they're in the middle of negotiations. None of their staff have sick leave. They won't hire people full-time, so they don't have to give them benefits. We're really trying to make an impact on people. Would you be willing to come out and help me out? And I thought, sure, great, I'll come out there. And sure enough, I was in there with everybody protesting, wearing my little collar. Y'all have been shocked I had a collar on. It was fun. And, we'd go and talk into the managers, and I'm right in there saying, so do you have sick leave? Does your staff have sick leave? How hard is it? How does this perpetuate poverty and illness if people aren't given a fair wage and a fair way to work? And talking to people about this. Now, I was volunteering. I volunteered, and I was there. I was going to be there fully for myself for that time. But for Sarah, this is truly her ministry. She is deeply committed to this. There's a fire in the eyes of people when you see them when they're involved in it. Now, I could make this my ministry, but I'm kind of waiting to see what this church wants to do. I have interest in some other areas. Her area is economic justice. I was volunteering, and I was still there. When we volunteer, we're still there. We're helping out and everything. But I think that when we go beyond volunteering is when we actually think about mission. What is the mission of this church? So if you're doing a slideshow, or you're ushering, or you're serving on a committee, you're thinking about the mission of this church. So let's take a moment to review what our mission is. We've got a brand new mission statement. It's to transform our lives and our communities by living our principles. To transform our lives and our communities by living our principles. When we use that as the sort of the way that we want to do whatever it is that we're volunteering for, then it becomes ministry. It goes beyond volunteering. It says, okay, this is how we want to create church. So when people walk in the door, the usher isn't just saying, oh, here's a pamphlet, right? But they're saying, how can I make this a place where we are transforming lives and our communities by living our principles? What are our principles? How are we going to do that? And this is the way that people make a ministry. I want to give you examples of people in this church who have ministries beyond just volunteering. One is Charlie Reed. Most of us here know Charlie Reed. He's been here, I think, longer than God. He's been here for a very long time, and he has been the convener and coordinator of our AIDS team ministry for over 20 years, from its time of its very beginning. This is where we work with Shanti in creating meals that we bring to people with AIDS. And he has been the coordinator of this, and he is literally just now retiring from this after 20 years. Bless his heart. They're down now. The thing that's so wonderful about Shanti and the AIDS team ministry is they started off with dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of clients, and they're now down to one. This is what medicine has done in our ministry. And how amazing is that we've been there this whole time. And through Charlie and what he's done. This was his ministry here in this church. And another is Adair Small, who has been this congregational nurse for a number. She retired last year, but that was her ministry to the church. She was a nurse, and she brought that professionalism here and built up an entire ministry. For some, that ministry might be being a president or serving on a committee. And it doesn't need to be 20 years in one position or doing one thing. But we each have our way of doing a ministry. It might be something that we change. So my question for you today is, what is your ministry? What is it that you want to do? How do you want to live out this mission? This coming year we're going to explore what this mission means to the ministry of this church. But today, just think for yourself, what will it mean for you? What is your ministry? Now, some of you I know that many of you are very, very committed and have done wonderful things. But I invite you to consider it in the context of this particular new mission statement. We say love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. Every time I say that, I'm always like, ooh, law. Wow. So does that mean I get to write tickets if somebody isn't actually participating in something? That's what I want to know. So law. It feels like kind of tough words to me. Service is ministry, right? Well, the word law, I actually take it to mean something like the way that they think of the Torah in the Jewish tradition. The Torah is the first 5 books of what we would call the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament. They call that the Torah. And for them, the Torah is often translated as law, Jewish law. But it really means much more than law. It really means the divine calling of the Jewish people. It's what God asks of them. So when I hear the word law and service is our law, I take that to mean, what does our Unitarian Universalist faith ask of us? Which is a kind of a tough question. I believe it asks us to share the ministry of this church, to live out its mission. Because as you know, as we sang, step by step, no one person can do it all. A lot of churches try to make one person do it all. They go insane. But I think what makes also, well, we have this democratic polity, which is our biggest spiritual practice out there. It's different from many other churches, from most churches. The other thing that makes us different, that makes it different from volunteering, is that, as Parker Palmer says, he says, true communities take the form of covenant. Now, covenant is another Jewish traditional word, and it simply means a promise. Covenant can sound a little bit scary, like, oh my goodness, you got a covenant, give me your firstborn or something. No, a covenant actually is a promise to God and from God. It's something that's reciprocal. In the Jewish tradition, it's a vertical covenant, so they have it with God. And what's also their God's promise to the Jewish people, that they will lead them to the promised land, that sort of thing. Our covenant is horizontal. It's among ourselves. It's the promises that we make to ourselves. To me, it's held within our new mission. How are we living this out? It's the way we treat one another, and we say it each week. Love is the spirit of this church. Service is its law. These are the promises that we make to one another. So our greatest challenge is, how do we keep that promise about what is it that's actually being asked? As Parker Palmer points out, to be a true community, that ministry needs to be shared. We've got a lot going on this coming year. We've got growth going on. We're going to be building new programs. We're building, hopefully, a new sanctuary. Maybe not this year, but hopefully in the years to come, we will be doing that. And it's not just each of you volunteering. It's not about just each of you volunteering or even just pledging. It's about making a commitment to serve the church, to serve the mission of this church, to be a minister to it, to share in its joys and sorrows, its challenges and celebrations. And that is what shared ministry is. And for many of you have been its minister. You've dedicated much of your lives to this community. You are ministers, not volunteers. You worry and fret over the church. You fight for it. Sometimes you obsess over it. You know that it's bigger than your needs and your wants, though sometimes it's hard to remember. You want to grow because you know that we have a community that others want to be a part of. You've been ministers to this church, even if you don't call yourselves that. Because here's the reality. Each one of us have been the characters in each of our story today. We've been the confident and then fearful horse, the mean and paranoid mouse, the goat who's worried about everything all the time, or that very thoughtful donkey who wonders, maybe he's just afraid. And that creature, the one that brought them all together, I like to think of that's that transcendent power that Palmer was talking about. That's the spirit of shared ministry. That's the voice of the holy that's inside of all of us that brings us all together and says, we can do this together. And all these voices are part of community, they're part of shared ministry, because there is something miraculous that happens when we all come together to tackle that next big thing. That's when we all become ministers. May it be so, blessed be, and amen.